And he was like, I can't manipulate you anymore, can I? And I'm like, no. Like, I told you while you were away working on you, I've been here working on me. Right. So once the mom who then, and I said some, I still carry very heavy in my heart. I said some pretty mean and ugly things to my son because I thought, well, if
Mm-hmm.
I'm nice and you're not listening, if I'm mean to you, maybe I'll be mean enough you'll listen to me. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so all of that was gone, just kind of like we're talking. I was able to become very matter of fact with him, this
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
is what will be tolerated in this house and this is what will not. And I am going to follow through with that. And when he
You're listening to When God Intervenes, the podcast where faith, hope, and healing come together for families with a loved one battling addiction. All right, I'm back. I'm your host, Daryl Rogers, and I'm here with Dana Carroll. And Dana and I have known each other for several years now. I don't know, maybe 5 years or more. And Dana I think we first met when she was attending a PAL group, Parents of Addicted Loved Ones, peer support group for parents that I've been facilitating for a while. And she's just always been a really good resource. Anytime I needed questions answered for parents about treatment options and other resources, Dana's always been able to answer my questions. So she was kind of my go-to has been my go-to when I need answers about things like that. So anyway, welcome, Dana. I'm glad you're here with us today.
Thank you very much, Daryl, for this opportunity to join and engage in the summit. I'm very grateful.
Well, good.
And
I'm glad you could be here.
yeah, kind of as you mentioned, I know it was definitely pre-COVID when we met, and you're right.
Yeah.
I was definitely a parent doing a lot of different activities, trying to grow my knowledge and abilities to parent an addicted loved one. And I do think we connected probably at a meeting, and then I did join in and attend the PAL Parenting Addicted Loved One meetings.
So why don't we start out with you just tell us a little bit about your journey, what brought you into this line of work, and then we'll go from there.
And I began in this field probably about 7 years ago. I might name drop a few good programs that I was at. I worked for Fellowship Hall, that's adult addiction recovery out of Greensboro. And I got connected to them from the work that I was doing at the North Carolina Medical Society. They are in connection with now it's called Professional Health Plan. It used to be Physician's Health Plan, headed by the CEO, Joe Jordan, and Dr. Clark Gaither is the medical director there. And I was managing their scholarship for those that were going to treatment and heading into recovery. And through that connection, Joe said to me, we don't want to lose you in the role that you're doing with us, but we think you would be a great representative at Fellowship Hall. And so through that introduction, that was kind of how I had the leap into the treatment placement world. And at the time, it was really on my heart because my son was in treatment. Joe was helpful to me, although he didn't work in the adolescent field. He had some connections and he was able to give me some resources. And so I had a son at the time, was 13, 14. And so we were looking to navigate the treatment world. And Joe saw what I was able to do for my own son and said, you'd be great at that. So I worked at Fellowship Hall, and then unfortunately COVID happened. And then since then, I had a placement at one of the wilderness programs. And then previous to being at Family First, I was at Newport Healthcare, where I worked for a couple years for adolescents and young adults and was instrumental in their opening of the local site that they have in the Carolinas is in the Charlotte area. And so then joined with Family First Adolescent Services back in March. And our program is growing. We'll be adding a sister program called Roots Renewal Ranch. So I'll also be working to help place adolescent females for treatment as well. So one of the things that I want folks to know today is that not only is it my career, I'm very, very blessed to be able to give back to help parents because I once made that phone call. And, Daryl, I know that we talk about it. That's a hard phone call to make,
It
right?
is.
It's
Yeah.
it's a, it's a hard decision to make. It's a hard call to make as a parent. It's You don't know where to turn, you don't know who to ask. That's why I'm so glad in the relationship that we share, like you're willing to reach out to me, and connect with me or connect me to other families. I'm always willing to share resources, whether it's based upon insurance or location or client need. One of the things that I kind of learned in my own journey was everyone can have a great website and everyone can have a great program. But if
Hmm.
that match isn't the right match for the person going to treatment,
Hmm.
um, it's not going to be successful. And sometimes it's not successful because the person isn't ready. Sometimes it's not successful because the person doesn't have sometimes maybe some of the developmental skills to engage in the program. And the program's
Hmm.
wonderful, just not the right connection. Through my son's journey, I've met lots of families from all across the country. And some of the places that my son went that weren't the best for him, and he might say that, and I might say that, I still have parents that I connect with that I hear that their sons are doing thriving and doing great,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
So it's really in this work, it's really about making the right fit and not making the
Hmm.
client fit to the program, but making sure that the program fits for the client.
Yeah.
Um, and I'm really blessed that the places that I have been along the way taught me those, I bring to the field solid professional and ethical feelings myself, but the places that I've been have really been understanding that if that program isn't the right fit, let's make the appropriate referral and resources,
Hmm.
for the family.
Hmm.
And, I think one of those things too is really maybe before we kind of get into just kind of talking about my own family journey is just talking a touch maybe about levels of care, right? Because a lot of people don't know and don't understand, right? When something happens to us physically, we go to the doctor, right? And we're just kind of referred and given the right next level, higher level, or specified level of care. And that doesn't always happen in mental health or in substance use disorder recovery, right? It's kind of like people kind of scratch their head and they're like, well, we don't know where to tell you, or we don't have resources. And so that's frustrating for parents, right? There's outpatient where you go maybe once a week or maybe you go once a month. And then there's intensive outpatient where you go a couple hours a day, 3 or 4 times a week. And then PHP, partial hospitalization, where they go maybe 5 or 6 hours a day, four,
Hmm.
5, 6 days a week. And then there's residential care, which is a level of care that I'm representing. So it's that step up between PHP, but it's not hospitalization. Inpatient,
Right.
hospitalization, stabilization. A lot of folks kind of view that as treatment. And that, along with detox, you can kind of put detox maybe before inpatient stabilization or kind of on that same bar, right? And in kind of those settings, the real goal is keeping the person safe, keeping the person physically safe in detox and in inpatient stabilization, physically safe from their thoughts of harming themselves or harming someone else. And then, kind of along that line, and in those mix, is also wilderness therapy. And that's, we can take a touch on that too, is taking a big hit with some social media things and some things that have been done in the past decades ago that industry perhaps didn't know better at the time, and now they know better and do better to be able to help care for those that don't kind of meet the criteria for inpatient stabilization, but maybe
Hmm.
residential, they might be a little aggressive, so they kind of might fit in that band. And I say all those levels of care, Daryl, because when I was preparing for this, I thought, wow, like my family really, we kind of hit all those levels,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And then there's aftercare, right? So then what happens after residential? And I'll get to that a bit, right? Is it a therapeutic boarding school? Is it a special recovery high school coming back to? Is it a structured sober living, right? There's just there are resources. It's finding them, it's making the appropriate connection, and it's really looking at the finances, right? Because
Hmm. Hmm.
I know for me, it wasn't, this journey is not only physically stressful, it's emotionally stressful, and it's financially stressful.
Yeah.
And so the goal is how do you as a parent come out on the other side whole and of yourself and still in a good relationship with your child that's going through programming, and if you have other children, with them as well, right? That other child, who in our case was a daughter, my daughter, she didn't escape everything, right? She saw the unmanageability, the chaos in our home.
Hmm. Hmm.
um, and there were times when I had set some things aside to be special for her that ended up being crisis or a need for the other child, for my son. And so it's really trying to make that balance.
Yeah.
It's not easy. I think parenting's not easy. We do the best we can. I know that no one wakes up and says they want any illness, whether it's addiction, whether it's mental illness, whether it's cardiology concerns or diabetic or cancer or anything, right? And so the day that things just kind of landed in my lap, I was kind of like, huh, I don't know, what am I going to do? Where do I turn?
It
Um,
is overwhelming, and I remember going through that myself with our son, Chase. I started out pretty early on contacting an interventionist, but I was already, I felt we were already pretty much in crisis mode and I was kind of in panic mode. And so I was looking already at treatment options, but I didn't have a lot of good things picked out and didn't understand anything about treatment. So it was very much overwhelming for me. And I always tell parents to try to get that piece of the puzzle figured out first, like where are they going to treatment, if they go to treatment, when they go to treatment, because you don't want to be in panic mode trying to make those kinds of decisions.
right? I've done therapy, outpatient therapy for years, for decades. My dad was a social worker. That was his profession. So as a family, I'd always felt very supported in seeking that type of help when I needed, which is important. But you're so right. But it is an emotional decision, or your emotions
Mhm.
play part on it, right?
Mhm.
And if I may, like, it is a big person, like a house or a car or something else,
Yeah,
right? And so,
yeah.
they say don't make those decisions emotional, but you can't always take the emotions out of it. So yeah, so we had been doing it started my son had been doing some outpatient therapy,
Hmm.
and I didn't see much progress. And unfortunately, there was an uptick in his anger and his aggression, and it was towards me, which at the time I didn't know. And I've later learned that's more about reactive attachment disorder, right? So during this process, I've learned why these behaviors happened to him and why I behaved the way I did, because I was also being reactive back to him. And I was also
Hmm.
being
Hmm.
enabling to him that I didn't know. It's right. That's the other part. As a mom, when your child's a teenager, you're responsible for your child. So,
Hmm. Hmm.
kind of that, let them hit bottom. And, all of those things are hard when your child should be just getting up and going to middle school and engaging in his sports. And life wasn't that way. And then he found a coping mechanism to be using substances, and he had some friends that he was using those substances with. The difference was, for him, was they could get up and go to school the next day. He couldn't,
Right.
right?
Hmm.
He and I have even talked about that over the last few years. He's like, he goes, it always blew me away, right? Like, how could they do that? Like, I couldn't do that. But he also didn't realize that they had the ability to shut the switch off and say, "Oh, I've had enough," and
Hmm.
he continued to go. His adrenaline and his likeness to stay calm and all those things kept him going. And that he also has the gene or the switch of addiction that
Hmm.
he didn't
Hmm.
choose You didn't know. You know, during this journey, we had a lot of things that happened. I'm divorced. We had to try to do some co-parenting and see if Dad would engage in some things, and that wasn't an option. Dad's suggestion, and we tried, was military school, military academy, right? Like, if he's not behaving and listening, we'll put him somewhere in a strict environment. And I'm here to tell those parents that those places are great if that's what they need educationally. That's not the place to send your child for mental health or
We
substance.
did that. We did that, and it was really my idea. And I did not know that Chase, and I still can't say for sure that he was already using substances at that point. I just, I knew he had the ADHD diagnosis. He was having trouble in the classroom. His, you know, his, I felt like the structured environment and the discipline would be good for him, but I would tell parents, yeah, I would agree with you to be very careful about that because for us, at least, it seemed like sending him from the fire into the frying pan because it seemed like they looked the other way a lot of times with families, at least this particular place that he went at this particular time that he went there. It seemed like they were looking the other way because on certain things, on certain behaviors, because of the families that were paying. They were so. I mean,
Right.
I hate to say that, but that's the way it seemed to me at the time. And I did not feel like it was being run. I thought a military school would be run like the military, right?
Right. Right.
And it didn't seem to be as much that way as I thought it would. And there were definitely a lot of things that were slipping through the cracks. And in fact, he told his mother that that's where he started with it. That was the first time he used substances. Now, I don't know if that's necessarily true or not, but he certainly experimented with some substances while he was there.
And my son did the same. You know, before my son was admitted, he had to have psychological assessment to prove that he was mentally fit to be there, much like a regular
Hmm.
physical. So he
Hmm.
passed that. He was there. We thought, okay, we'll start it off just for the summer program. We'll see how he does. I don't recall at this point, 4 or 6 weeks, whatever it was, but it was like he had like a week left to go. And I get this phone, I'm at work, and I get this phone call that says, he's threatening to harm himself. He's having suicidal ideations, and
Hmm.
either we send him to the local hospital or you can come pick him up. Right. And it's, you don't expect that phone call at 11 a.m. on the day that you have a full team meeting that you're presenting at, or, all of those things. And I don't fault my child, but it does always seem like everything always happens at the same time, right?
Hmm.
I,
Hmm.
it seemed like things always happened when I wasn't at my best. He
Right.
wasn't at his best, right? Like that whole
Uh-huh.
connection, right? Sun, moon, star alignment. So I went and picked him up, and he came home shortly thereafter. He, kind of admitted that he just didn't want to be there anymore, and he knew that would get him home. And then we had a lot of talk about suicide and about what that really means to make that claim and what really would happen to him if he said those things. And so I said to him going forward, like, if you make that threat, I am going to have to take action on that to make sure that you stay safe, right? And there were some other times where he would threaten me. I knew at some level he wouldn't harm me, but there were other times that I just really wasn't sure because of the substances that he was
Right.
taking could
Hmm.
have him behave in a different way. And
Hmm.
one day, it happened to be a Mother's Day. My daughter and I came home from church, and my son had some folks in the house, and things didn't go well. And so it was a really rough day. It happened to be one of those days I had to do an involuntary commitment, working with the therapist, going to Hammond Road and doing the documentation, having that hearing, having police come and pick him up, have him leave our house in zip ties. The police were very kind to work with him and talk to him, and I was scared, and he was scared, and my daughter was scared. And that's Mother's Day is a day that's to be celebrated, and it forever changed our world, right? I never, not only was it a hard decision, it was just on a day that I never thought I'd have to make that decision on.
Right.
But that's what really led us to knowing that, okay, this regular outpatient therapy isn't enough. It isn't working. So he did the stabilization and they were willing to keep him a few extra days. I had reached out to some family resources that I had. I got connected to an educational consultant, which is an individual that I had to pay to kind of help me navigate what care would look like.
Mm-hmm.
Um, he met that criteria at the time for wilderness therapy versus didn't need locked residential or to continue at inpatient. But really, that aggression was really only towards me, not towards peers. He seemed to do well at school when he went to school. So we did wilderness therapy. When I talked to the ed consultant, I said, anything but that. I was like, I don't think he'll like that. There's kind of some past trauma in our family around wilderness and guns and some other things. I was like, yeah. But he went, he was there, and that was hard because it was, writing letters at first, and I didn't get to talk to him, didn't get to see him. And working with the family therapist, Jacob Thomason is the family therapist. And I've often said to him, we've remained connected. And I said, he saved our family. He really taught me a lot. He really helped me to realize how to be a mom to this teenage boy that had some pretty significant trauma. How do I show up as a parent, providing that structure and yet compassion and love that he still needed?
Mm-hmm.
My son had to read a lot of different things when he was in wilderness. I read a lot of the same books. One of the really good books, and I still have it here with me, and I recommend it to a lot of parents. I don't know if you can see it. Hope it's okay. We're allowed to
Oh yeah.
someone's
Yeah.
book, Chrissy Pozatek, The Parallel Process.
Mm-hmm.
For as many things as Jacob and some of the other family therapists during our journey taught me, I I could hear it and I could process it in the moment in therapy, but to read it in the book when I was by myself, I could really absorb that and take that in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's so easy for us as parents to get caught up in the anxiety and the stress of our day-to-day life and our child being away that but I really needed to take those quiet moments and read that book and kind of learn for myself, right?
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
we started down the path. So he does wilderness. They say, okay, coming home really probably wouldn't be the safe option, right? What do they say? Same playground, same players when you come back home, right?
Mm-hmm.
When you've been
Mm-hmm.
away about 3 months, they're like, that's really not as long enough time in sobriety to have him, be away from the substances. He really unpacked a lot of good trauma work. Let's do a therapeutic boarding school for about a year back into the spring and then transition him back home and back to school. And financially, that was going to be really tight and emotionally and physically. But I thought, if all the odds and statistics say longer in sobriety, better chance to kick it, all those types of things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And back then, health insurance didn't cover anything, didn't cover wilderness, didn't cover boarding school. I finally got some things covered from the group session. So he was in Wisconsin for wilderness. He went to Idaho for therapeutic boarding school. He didn't want to go, but we had an agreement. When we left and went to wilderness, we did use an interventionist. We did use a transporter. However, he said, if you just have someone come and take me in the middle of the night, I'm going to go kicking and screaming and I'm not going to stay. So don't do that to me. And my son was a wrestler, very good wrestler. So I was like, never wanted to put someone else in that way, right?
Right.
Because I've seen what he can twist like a pretzel for some other people.
Mm-hmm.
So I said, okay, so we wouldn't. So the interventionist, we left from Raleigh and we flew to St. Paul, Minnesota, the Twin City. And then the interventionist met us there and drove us to the wilderness. And that was really good. I think it really helped to maintain our relationship. It took the stress off of me of driving somewhere a little more secluded by myself, right? It
Mm-hmm.
really was a good fit. And so he was a holdout. He's the longest holdout. I think it was 8 or 10 hours that he wouldn't go out into the field, but he finally did and did wilderness. And then we did therapeutic boarding school. He did agree, he didn't want to, but he went and he got there and he seemed to be, doing well. He seemed to be engaging, kind of, as I say, buying into the program. And then the boys were playing flag football and he got a concussion.
Ah,
And at the time, again, emotion, stress, all those things. And that was shortly before parent weekend. And I think the next week I was going for parent weekend. And I went for parent weekend and I could just see in him the change from the concussion. He'd
mm,
had them before from wrestling. And I just, I said to the folks on the team, I said to the consultant, I said, it really set him back. I
yeah.
just, right. And I get it's hard, like moms are emotional and all those things. But I just feel he didn't have much growth after there and things kind of declined. And then we went for the Thanksgiving visit and he had been involved, the boys had been involved in some hazing, but they said they'd work that out. And then I'm boarding the plane with my daughter to come back. We're in Spokane. I'm boarding the plane and the executive director calls and says, oh, we decided he has to leave. And I'm like, what? Right? So to parents out there, I say, I get it when things change on a dime, or you think you have these plans in mind, or at the same time, I was talking to my consultant and I said, I think we're going to need to look for a different place. The therapist that he had was a male and he had left and they'd gotten this new therapist and he kind of seemed like he was running her ragged, right? Like, so if you can hear and you can see, like, it didn't go easy, right? Even though I'd hired the consultant, by now I'm kind of getting the lay of the land of the field.
Mm,
So he goes back to wilderness. He was in the wilderness in the summer in Wisconsin. He was in the wilderness in the heat of the summer and then in the cold of the winter with negative 13 and 14 degrees. But when he was there the second time, he did his own programming and then he was kind of a mentor to some of the younger boys. And that really seemed to go well. And so then from there, we did structured sober living. He went
mm,
to Portland, Maine, structured sober living at Foundation House. That was amazing for him. He was nearly, he's 17, going to be 18, kind of transitioning to be a young man around a group of guys that were supportive in his recovery. And he just really seemed to be doing really well. And he'd been there, I'm going to say he was there 4 or 5 months. Kind of thought maybe he'd continue there. Then I was kind of concerned around some expenses. And then I was like, okay, do we bring him back home to start school? Which of course we did. And then of course what happened? Same playground, same players.
mm, mm.
And so he was back home and then a return to use. And, I had been going to Al Anon. I think this may have been around the time I started with you with Pal, even.
Okay.
I think, right? It's kind of starting to, as I'm sharing some of it, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Um, and I was really struggling because I was frustrated. Like, I don't have that mind or the brain that I guess, as they say, I'm a normie, right? Like, never used illicit drugs, but I can have alcohol and I can set it down and walk away from it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I don't understand that because that's not my mind or that's not my brain. And, just
Right.
looking at him, just being like, just don't do that. Like, just
Right.
why are you doing that, and
Yeah.
knowing that that's right. And then also from all the parent work I'd done and the reading, like coming back at him from a different approach, right? Like, so this time now he's home and he would say these things to me and he wouldn't get the same reaction. And he was like, I can't manipulate you anymore, can I? And I'm like, no. Like, I told you while you were away working on you, I've been here working on me. Right. So once the mom who then, and I said some, I still carry very heavy in my heart. I said some pretty mean and ugly things to my son because I thought, well, if
Mm-hmm.
I'm nice and you're not listening, if I'm mean to you, maybe I'll be mean enough you'll listen to me. Right.
Right. Yeah.
And so all of that was gone, just kind of like we're talking. I was able to become very matter of fact with him, this
Mm-hmm.
this
Mm-hmm.
is what will be tolerated in this house and this is what will not. And I am going to follow through with that. And when he turned 18, he had this lavish party and celebrated being an adult. And I told him, I said, if you do that and there's substance in this house, you're an adult now, you're going to have to find a place to live.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to do that. That was harder the day to do the involuntary commitment than it was that day. I think maybe because I'd already been through it once, and I knew he had some resiliency. He'd be able to, maybe I knew because he'd done the wilderness, he'd be able to kind of
Uh-huh.
take
Uh-huh.
care of himself. Now, by this point, it's into October, November. He hadn't been going to school. School never called. There's no real truancy officer that's coming to help. I've been to the school many times asking
Mm-hmm.
for that help. They're like, yeah, we don't have that. And we lived in an area where I'd reached out for any community resources, and they'd say, well, you're not at one of these high schools, so he doesn't qualify for those programs.
Mm-hmm.
So I remember my son has a peanut allergy. And so I remember this day, it was October, November, and we happened to have a snowfall. It was cold. So it was cold out. And he was
Mm-hmm.
kicked out of the house. And he went to school. He went to school and he went to the counselors and he said, you know, I need help. Like, my mom won't let
Oh.
me in, and I need this EpiPen, and I don't close. So the school calls me and they're like, oh, we need you to come pick up your son or bring him clothes. And I'm like, no. And they were like, what? And I was like, no. I said, I'm like, where have you been for the last 10 weeks trying to,
Right. Mm-hmm.
I said,
Mm-hmm.
I said, and of course I knew many of them well, and, there were some different things. So, I said to him, when you're ready, there are resources, Healing Transitions, program that we have in
Mm-hmm.
Raleigh, and through some of the other connections that I had by attending my own family programming, I was able to get a couple guys to come pick him up and take him to Healing Transition. So we went to Healing
Okay.
Transition. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
he was there for a while, and he did struggle there, I think, without really understanding or knowing it at that time. There was, I think, a lot more on the mental health side going on with him than just the substance
Mm-hmm.
side. And he was seeing a doctor that had put him on some medication that I think really he didn't have the diagnosis that they thought he had. And so when he took that medicine, it really messed him up. So we ended up having to do kind of a revisit on some more psychiatric help. And then and because of that, he did leave Healing Transitions, just because at the time that wasn't a service. Totally understand that they provide, right? So then,
Mm-hmm.
he did good for a while, and then he, kind of drifted back into things. And we did adult addiction recovery, kind of as I mentioned. He went to, I worked at Fellowship Hall now at this time, and he was able
Mm-hmm.
to go there, and he got some real good foundation in sobriety. And then he did structured sober living. He was in Asheville, and then came back, and he was at Next Step, and then he came back and he went to Green Hill, and did their programming. And he did really well for probably a solid year and a half, maybe even
Mm-hmm.
longer, and then was working, and throughout this process got his GED, right? This bright, smart kid that I'm thinking is going to be like maybe someday working on Wall Street or doing analytics. And,
Mm-hmm.
so there's a lot for that as a parent, like letting go. Our kids don't realize that when their future changed, our thoughts and our future for them changes as
Yeah.
well. It's
Yeah.
like it's a big dynamic change.
Yeah.
So, so there's all those kinds of things. So he did really well. And then he was going to turn 21. And he came to me and he said, Mom, he said, I'm going to have a drink for my 21st birthday. And I said to him, I love you. And I know that you know the resources. If you choose to do that, that's your choice. You have to make that for you. I said, I'm not, I'm not, it's not my place to pass the judgment. I know that if you can't handle it, you know where the resources are, but I want to let you know that I'm not paying for more treatment. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And continuing to do outpatient therapy. And I said, I'll pay for that. But if you have that slide and that decline, checkbooks closed on those kinds of things. And I'll say he's now going to be 25. He
Mm-hmm.
does drink alcohol. He does manage that. So I don't know if that's a thing that's not the substances that he was using back in the day. And he knows he
Mm-hmm.
can't use those substances, and he doesn't. But he can also have a beer and have 3 sips and leave it. which is not typical, right? And I
Right.
was,
Mhm.
even though I told him, well, you do what you need to do, on the inside, I was shaking in my boots because I'm
Right.
thinking, oh no, here we go down that journey, down that road, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Mhm. But he's done well, as the parent, right? How does that look in those things? And I had to trust him. I had to give over control. I had to let him learn from his mistakes. Um,
Mhm.
I did have to be the one that let him guide and do his own journey. And then in this process, as that parent, what's that like when you reach out and you make those calls, or you call a place, or I even places that my child had been, right? I get a call and he's acting up, he's not following the rules, they put him on a plan, didn't make the stage, didn't make the transition, what, right? And now at this stage, I'm working in the industry, like I'm meeting and shaking hands with these people at a networking event on Wednesday night, or having
Mhm.
lunch with them
Mhm.
for work, thinking, you know, my kid should be doing all the right thing, but everyone gave me grace because they knew that I couldn't control him.
Yeah.
I had to let him have this journey and have this path. And
Mhm. Mhm.
um, and I would like to say that I don't worry, but of course I do. Having another child, I've seen her go through some lumps and bumps, definitely had experimentation. Girls, COVID was really tough on her for, body image and eating disorder. And I mean, there's just been so many different things. And I
Mhm.
could talk about how my son, worked and got an injury on the job and then had to go for workers' comp. And then they're like, oh, wait, we see your notes from 10 years ago of, they were like, you have opiate disorder, which, like he said, he goes, well, if they're going to name my drug, at least name it right. That wasn't what I used. Right. Like,
Right.
some of these different things that over the times when you sign on to be a parent, I never thought any of this was headed down my way.
Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
lost friends. My daughter lost friends. There were
Mm.
kids that my daughter went to school with that parents were like, yeah, we're not going to have our child be around your child with that type of brother. Right.
Right.
I've had other parents who've said things to me like, when their child's making the honor roll or the dean's list, or, crushing it wherever. Oh, yeah, that's because of our good parenting or my good
Right.
parenting. You know,
Yeah.
we're all good parents. We're all doing the best we can with what we have.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. And including ours, where you have siblings who um, don't have any of those issues at all. And so you go, well, how can you attribute this one child? And families that I've known that have maybe 4 or 5 kids, and one child has a substance use disorder. So how can you attribute that to bad parenting? Hopefully, people are beginning to change their attitudes a little bit about this as there's more awareness now, I think, than there's ever been before, because it has affected so many people. I'm so glad you brought up the wilderness program, because I don't think anyone else that I've interviewed has touched on wilderness, and really has not touched on some of the aftercare. We really haven't talked about that a lot. So I'm glad you brought those things up.
and wilderness, as of recent, they've had some tragedies. I know Paris Hilton has had her documentary about her programming, and I will openly disclose. My son's very angry about what happened to him at some of his placements.
Hmm.
There were
Hmm.
some things that were less than stellar. I don't shy away from those conversations with him. I think that in this industry, like any industry, I always say we need our basket. We need our golden apples, our red apples, our green apples, our bruised and our rotten apples. We need to
Hmm.
know who everyone is, right? But we
Hmm.
know better and we need to do better. And when we see someone not stepping up to the plate to do the right thing, we do need to have conversations about that so that as an industry as a whole, we don't suffer.
Hmm.
Um, I think that's really important. And then there is something that you brought up, Daryl. You kind of mentioned, you talked about, like, how is it one child and not the other children and different things. At Family First, they use the NARM model, the neuroaffective relationship model, that really talks about, and I'm not the clinician, so I'm going to give it kind of a layman's terms of really like how at different developmental stages there have been traumatic things that have happened to the person that can impact those
Yeah.
outcomes later for that dysregulation, right? And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I go back to many things. I wouldn't change it because I wouldn't have my child here. I had a history of cancer. So I had to have a certain surgery to be able to have children. And that happened when my son was in utero.
Mm-hmm.
So could that first initial exposure to substances be the reason? Certainly it could be, right?
Mm-hmm.
He, as I mentioned, he has this peanut allergy. Every year he had to have blood tests, very traumatically be like papoosed to this table to have this blood work done. Could that do it? That dysregulation? Certainly. He's had ear tubes, he's had surgeries. Could that do it? Certainly. He's had several concussions, certainly. And then there were other things that were, he's had some big T traumas. I've had many times that I've cried and beaten myself up as a parent, like, shoulda, coulda, woulda, right?
Yeah.
As we know, I
Yeah.
can't should on myself. I, at every age and stage, I was doing the best I could to parent him and to manage myself, because I've had some times within myself that, my own probably mental health wasn't the best, whether it was from anxiety or depression. I
Mm-hmm.
struggle with depression, so I'm sure that's impacted both of my children.
Mm-hmm.
um, but the thing that I know now and that I can do now, and that we all have together, is we've all worked the steps, and we do go back to each other at different times, and we make our amends when it's safe and appropriate to do so. My son has been able to forgive me for some things, and I'm very grateful for that. And I have forgiven my son for many things, and I know he's grateful for that. And it's life is a work in progress. We learn every day, and it's hard because it's hard to work in this field and see other family members or friends and their children go through things. And at different times some of my kids will say, Mom, aren't you gonna, you need to tell them, I said, no, I gotta stay in my lane. That's,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
ask if anyone ever needs help. I have connections in the adolescent field, the young
Mm-hmm.
adult field, the adult field, the professional field. Like, I'm always happy to give resources, but I know it's not my place to interject and say,
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think you have X, Y, or Z, and you need X, Y, and Z, right? That's, it's not my
It is
place.
hard. It is hard sometimes to remain silent when you see people making some of the same mistakes that, when I see other people making some of the same mistakes that I made already, and I'm going, man, I can save you some heartache there. But, sometimes you can't really, you're not in a position to be able to speak up, like you said, unless they ask. Tell us a little bit about Family First Adolescent Services, and tell us how people can get in touch with you.
Sure, sure. So, Family First Adolescent Services, as I mentioned, is in Palm Beach, Florida. It is a residential program, so it would be kind of that bump up from partial hospitalization and that bump down from inpatient stabilization. But folks don't necessarily have to go to that inpatient stabilization to come to us. One of the things I like to share with folks is, and especially with clinicians, is when you start to see, this is the thing I notice of myself, when the therapist spends more time with the mom and
Mhm.
or the dad, the parents, and less time face to face with the client, that might be an idea that there's a need for a level of care change. Guys come and they stay with us a minimum of 45 days, can be
Mhm.
longer, 60 or 90 days. We look to utilize insurance to cover the cost of care. Sometimes there is out of pocket costs, such as deductible and additional costs that are required based upon insurance and length of stay. We work a lot with, as the name says, Family First. We have a family therapy component. Guys that are with us see the family therapist. Parents do that virtually. And then collectively, virtually, they have that family therapy, as well as the guys working on any of those developmental traumas, as I mentioned earlier, any of the big T traumas, little t traumas. We have guys ADHD, on the spectrum, substance use disorder, anger, aggression, ODD, all those different types of things. So they can come and work with us for that. Anyone can always reach out to me. My cell number is 704 387 8090. I always say the best way to reach me is text. Daryl probably and others listening can know that sometimes my emails get buried. Also, if you call me, if I'm doing something like this, I can't answer, or if I'm talking to another family, I can't answer, or if I'm meeting with a client, but I see my texts and I try to respond to them more regularly. And, I live in the Raleigh, Cary, North Carolina area. I'm always happy to meet with parents to have coffee or lunch to just kind of discuss things as well. I have many, if it's not me, I have many resources that I'm always happy to connect with, whether I feel there's a different program that could better serve their loved one, whether it's not the right age. I was that mom. I was crying. I was confused. I was embarrassed. I was afraid to say what was happening. So I say to the parents that I speak with, you're in a safe space. I'm not here to judge. You have enough shame and guilt that you're carrying yourself. I don't need to add any to that. I ask a lot of questions because in asking those questions helps me to understand where's the right program, right? That's the
Mm-hmm.
key. Because a failed program is time, money, emotion, all those things. And so I really want to help families to navigate to where they need to be and work with others like yourself, Daryl, that do, these support groups and interventions and transporting and aftercare resources, right? When we look at this, we can't look at it like it's a one time. And that's what I thought when I went into this. I thought,
Mm-hmm.
oh, I don't know, back as a kid, right? Buy the Cadillac model, you'll have the best. One and done, it'll be over. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
right. And willingness on the person going. Right. And I get
Mm-hmm.
at 13 and 14, who's willing to, right? I mean, everyone's got to have their path and their journey. And I feel blessed for those families that I've connected with that I've been able to help.
Every time I've needed to know something about options that are out there that are available for families that were reaching out to me, you've always been a big help to me. So and I appreciate that. It's tough going through this as a parent.
Oh, yeah.
I have my wife supporting me the whole time, and we're together as a unit, and that makes it a little bit easier. So it's really, but I know there are a lot of moms out there that are kind of, doing this on their own, and that's even harder. So my heart goes out to those mothers.
Thanks. And there's some dad, that do
Yeah,
it.
absolutely. Yeah,
I
yeah.
commend them. And I was lucky that I had parents and siblings who were supportive of me and friends who
Mhm,
checked in
mhm.
on me. And so I was lucky for that. I was blessed.
Well, Dana, it's been great having you here, and thank you for sharing with us today and for being here. I
But
appreciate you
it's a
being here.
great opportunity to just learn. And again, if I can be of help to anyone, please feel free to reach out. I'm always happy to be a resource.
Thank you, Dana.
Thanks, Daryl.
Thank you for tuning in to When God Intervenes. If you found today's episode helpful, please subscribe and leave a review. Your feedback helps us reach more families in need of hope and healing. For more resources and support, visit our website at thefamilyrecoverycoach.com. Until next time, stay strong and keep the faith.